Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the United Nations, welcome to this event, our goal of world community, the United Nations at 75. We are honored to be co-hosting this event alongside the NGO Committee on Human Rights. My name is Allison Hess. I use she, her pronouns, and my work in the office includes collaborating with congregations in the US and Canada to help them connect with UN initiatives and global peace and justice efforts. In just 2 days, on Saturday, October 24th, the world will celebrate United Nations Day, which marks the 75th anniversary of the founding of the United Nations. On this particular anniversary, celebration may not be quite the right word, as the world is struggling to overcome a devastating pandemic amid the rise of global authoritarianism and the chaos of an overwhelming climate crisis. Each year, our UUA office at the United Nations urges Unitarian Universalists to honor United Nations Day by dedicating a special worship service on Sunday to the United Nations and the theme of that year, which we call UN Sunday. This year's theme is All In for Climate Justice, People, Power, Planet. And we are grateful to all the congregations who will focus on being all in for climate justice this week and through their ongoing programming. During our time together this evening, we will take some time reflecting on the UN's legacy of the last 75 years, the UN's role and perspective in the current moment, and how Unitarian Universalists have and continue to make a difference. We'll hear from distinguished speakers with whom the UUA office at the UN works closely at the United Nations and within Unitarian Universalism. And with that, I will pass the baton to the director of the UUA office at the United Nations, Bruce Knox.
Welcome, everybody. The Unitarian Universalist Association office at the United Nations works in coordination with the Canadian Unitarian Council. As Gillian Sorensen, whom we will hear later, says, our office at the UN punches far above its weight. We are small but very influential in taking issues that were little regarded at the UN and making them into priority mainstream issues, such as our elevation of sexual orientation, gender identity, human rights, and launching the UN Decade of People of African Descent to end structural racism globally. For 58 years, we have promoted our values of inclusive diversity and service to others at the United Nations. Working with others, our office helped form Religions for Peace and the International Criminal Court. We continue promoting equity for all genders, ethnicities, indigenous peoples to ensure that everyone everywhere has a safe and dignified life. It is now my honor to introduce to you the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray. Susan brings a strong focus on mission and strategic planning to her leadership at the UUA as it works to dismantle systems of white supremacy. As president, Susan has emphasized that this is no time for a casual faith and no time to go it alone. Prior to her election, she served as lead minister of the Unitarian Universalist congregation in Phoenix, Arizona, where she was a national voice on immigrant rights. Prior to ministry, Susan worked briefly in the field of genetic sequencing, following her Bachelor of Science in Molecular Biology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Susan is married to the Reverend Brian Frederick-Gray, a minister in dual fellowship with the United Church of Christ, UCC, and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, DOC. Please welcome Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick-Gray.
Good evening. I'm Susan Frederick-Gray, president of your Unitarian Universalist Association, and it is my great pleasure to celebrate with you tonight the 75th anniversary of the United Nations and to celebrate the critical role that Unitarian Universalism has played and continues to play on the world stage through our office at the UN. I am so proud of the work of our office, all it has done. I'm proud of the leadership of Bruce Knox, of all of the staff and the interns, both past and present, and the work of Unitarians and Universalists globally in partnership across the world. Our work at the UN office is an embodiment of Unitarian Universalist principles and an investment in the world we long to live in, one with peace, liberty, and justice for all, a commitment embodied in our sixth principle. The UU at the UN office brings our Unitarian Universalist values to a global stage, forging and maintaining partnerships and relationships around climate justice, LGBTQ equity, racial justice, reproductive justice, and so much more. Friends, we are living in tumultuous and dangerous times. Across the world and in the United States, we are experiencing the weakening and corruption of democracy, the growth of authoritarianism and nationalism, a rise in ethnic, religious, and racist bigotry, violence, and intentionally xenophobic, racist, homophobic, and transphobic policies. So much is on the line. In a time of global pandemic, where we are being reminded in undeniable ways that we are all interconnected and that our actions and ways of being impact the health and well-being of others, we continue to see the erosion of international relationships and cooperation. In the United States, this has resulted in our withdrawal from vital international partnerships and agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, and growing disregard for the World Health Organization. One of the major themes of my presidency, two things that are absolutely clear to me are, number one, this is no time for a casual faith and no time for a casual commitment to our values. And number two, this is no time to go it alone, particularly in this context. Our investments in international relationships are critical in combating the rise of nationalism, exploitation, and disaster capitalism. And as a religion that says we are committed to justice, compassion, and equity in human relations, committed to the inherent worth and dignity of all people, committed to respect for the interdependent web of all life, we are being called as Unitarian Universalists in this time to invest more deeply in our values and in each other across the globe. I am inspired by the ways that UUs are showing up in so many significant and powerful ways, showing up for systemic change that puts people first, that sees the disease of racism, xenophobia, poverty, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, voter suppression, and climate destruction as intertwined issues, all serving to undermine people's ability to thrive. We are being called as Unitarian Universalists to invest in work, to organize together, to address all of these issues as a country and as a global community. I am so grateful to be a part of this gathering. Many blessings to all of you as we celebrate this milestone and again commit to building a world with peace, liberty, and justice for all.
It's now my honor to introduce to you the Executive Director of the Canadian Unitarian Council, Vyda Eng. Vyda has formed strong relationships within the UU faith community. That network of relationships became a solid base in helping build vital Unitarian communities in Canada. In addition to her experience within the Unitarian Universalist movement, Vyda has extensive prior experience working with vulnerable populations such as people living with mental health challenges, survivors of abuse, the elderly, LGBTQ community, women, children, as well as youth offenders. Vyda is a single parent of 3 young adults, originally from Malaysia. She came to Canada as a student and has lived in Saskatoon, Winnipeg, and St. John's. She now makes her home in Ontario. Please welcome Vyda Ng.
Thank you, Bruce. The world needs the United Nations, and the world needs Unitarian Universalism, whether it knows it or not only for the usual reasons of being in a faith tradition, but because Unitarian Universalists can be bridge builders. As a faith community that believes in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, in justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, in the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, Unitarian Universalists possess the tools to build those bridges, whether we know it or not. Indeed, we all have the ability to build those bridges, to form connections, networks, and partnerships, whether we know it or not. Here in Canada, Unitarian Universalists envision a world in which our interdependence calls us to love and justice. The UN is the only global organization that has the heft and the authority to join nations together to work towards sustainability, justice, equity, and the eradication of poverty. But many of us are only generally and peripherally aware of the impact of the UN. We kind of take it for granted, the way that we take oxygen or sunlight for granted, that it is there and will continue to be there. What would the world be without the United Nations? What would the world be without the United Nations? The Canadian Unitarian Council sponsors refugees with congregations to resettle in Canada. Just since 2015, we have helped almost 400 new Canadians come home. We would not be able to accomplish this without the United Nations and its refugee agency. To have Unitarian Universalists, to have all of us become those bridge builders, we need to push the work and the word of the United Nations. When John Peters Humphrey drafted the first Universal Declaration of Human Rights, he wasn't able to share it on Facebook or tweet about it. When fellow Canadian Elaine Harvey worked hard to help establish the International Criminal Court and to ensure that there were provisions to safeguard women, Instagram wasn't around. When Newton Bowles worked from 1948 to 2010, holding the record for longest service to the UN, to bring relief to millions of women and children facing war, violence, disease, and poverty, there were no videos of his work on YouTube. We have the tools. We need the passion. We need to build on the work that has gone on before and that continues now with the hundreds of thousands of dedicated staff, volunteers, and peacekeepers who work largely in the background. They maintain international peace and security, protect human rights, deliver humanitarian aid, promote sustainable development, and uphold international law. And we need to lift up the passion of new, young visionaries like Malala and Greta, like Rimu Sultana Rimu in Bangladesh, like Baba Mael from Senegal. We need to spread the word so that the work of the UN shines like lights across the globe to light up the world and lift it to peace, equity, and justice. Now more than ever, we have the tools. I ask that every Unitarian Universalist publicly support the United Nations. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. And because our principles call us to act. It is up to us to decide which forms that action will take. Some, like Bruce Knotts and Elson has at the UU at UN office, have dedicated their professional lives to advancing the work of the United Nations. One of the quickest things we can all do is to share your support voraciously on the social media tools you have. Do not let up. Talk with your family, friends, people in your congregations and communities. Write articles for your newsletters. We have networks across the world, from Transylvania to the Philippines, from the UK to South Africa, from the US and Canada to India. Let us use them. Share the stories that touch you, like the single mother of 4 in Sierra Leone, who, with the help of the International Fund for Agriculture, was able to transform swampland to high-yield paddy fields, and how a campaign in the Russian Federation encourages people living with HIV to start treatment. Do not let up. The more someone is exposed to a message, the more that message gets embedded, because that is what we need. For the message to get embedded, that we need the United Nations to achieve the goal of world community and global justice. Reverend Mark Morrison Reed, living in Toronto, Canada, wrote a reading on the task of the religious community. With apologies to Mark, I would like to paraphrase. The central task of our world community is to unveil the bonds that bind each to all. There is a connectedness, a relationship discovered amid the particulars of our own lives and the lives of others. Once felt, it inspires us to act for justice. It is the United Nations that assures us that we are not struggling for justice on our own, but as members of a larger community. The world community is essential, for alone our vision is too narrow to see all that must be seen, and our strength is too limited to do all that must be done. Together, our vision widens and our strength is renewed. We need the United Nations. We need each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Vyda. It's now my honor to introduce you to our dear friend, Gillian Sorensen. Gillian is the former United Nations Assistant Secretary General for External Affairs. She currently works with groups and organizations committed to peace, justice, development, refugees, and human rights. She serves as a member of the board of the International Rescue Committee and as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Gillian worked with the United Nations Foundation from 2003 to 2013 as a senior advisor and national advocate. Gillian is a lifelong Unitarian Universalist who grew up in Michigan. She graduated from Smith College and studied at the Sorbonne. She is the widow of Theodore C. Sorensen, aka Ted Sorensen, who served as President John F. Kennedy's speechwriter and special counsel. They are the parents of a daughter, Juliet Sorensen. And here's a personal note. I know how much my own spouse influences my writing, and I'm sure that Gillian influenced her husband as he wrote the profound and uplifting speeches of President John F. Kennedy. You will hear a few words from President Kennedy's words delivered in 1963 at the end of Gillian's presentation that are pertinent to our current circumstances. Please welcome Gillian Sorensen.
Thank you to Bruce Knox for his kind invitation to join the Unitarian Universalists as we mark the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. I'm very pleased and honored to join you. How I wish we were in person, but for the moment, Zoom will have to do. Bruce posed several questions and asked me to respond to these in my few words with you. First, at 75, why is the UN still important? Well, as you know well, the UN was born out of the ashes of war. The founders tried to learn from the failures of the League of Nations, which survived only 20 years. And this time, the United States chose to lead in an active way and was the host for the Charter Conference in San Francisco, the host and the inspiration, and in many cases, the drafter of that charter. They wanted to address problems that cross borders without passports. They understood that we can do more together than we can do alone, and that the new United Nations could be a unique and valuable instrument to address global crises that require global responses. It was an expression of idealism without illusion and an understanding that good intentions are not enough. What was needed was an international organization that would bring us together, that had a headquarters, a home base, where we could come to share the risk, the responsibility, the burdens, and the benefits of joint action. The United States played a unique leadership role and made clear that it was fully committed, active, and visible, and that the chance of success was always greater if the US was present. The UN's work to this day is in our national interest as well as the global interest. And as we all learned, sadly, the limits of military might, we also came to understand that work for peace was more important than ever. Today, every issue before the United Nations touches us: terrorism, peace and security, climate change and environmental degradation, global health and pandemics, traffic in drugs and arms, flows of refugees, efforts to promote democracy and support the oppressed and those without freedom, efforts to help those who are starving and dying of hunger. I was especially pleased to notice this week that the World Food Program, part of the United Nations, received the Nobel Peace Prize for its remarkable work. We know that the UN is a challenge, and we need to use it wisely and well, build on its strengths, and address its weaknesses. It is an expression of idealism tempered with realism, an expression of political will that succeeds when it has the human and financial resources to do just that. At the UN 75th, it's a good time to reassess, to look forward, and to seek again the confidence, hope, and optimism that was the motivation of the founders 75 years ago. So why should the Unitarian Universalists remain engaged? We know, of course, the UN is not a religious institution. There's no chapel or place of worship, only a meditation room. And yet during my many years of working there, I was often aware that we were all, many of us, inspired by faith and connected to the hope and dream of something larger than ourselves. Unitarian Universalist principles in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the commitment to compassion and equity in human relations, the goal of a world community of peace and justice and liberty, and the recognition of our interdependence as human beings, all of that fits easily, naturally within the UN context, as does the notion of service as an expression of faith. The Unitarians Universalists have for years been an active and eloquent NGO. Your voice, especially on the Sustainable Development Goals, has been extremely important, and your role as a caring critic and as an eloquent and informed ambassador and advocate to the larger world has been critical and essential to the building of public understanding and support. Any assistance you can give to model UNs and UN associations around the world is also very helpful and important. I have discovered, as I'm sure you have, that many young people long to make a difference and see the UN as one vehicle to that end. Unitarians and Universalists also understand the power of words. not just to inform, but also to unify and to inspire. And we know that within the UN, words are our weapons. I'm so grateful for the active presence of the UUs within the UN context, and hope that you find the time and place to carry your message forward. Finally, what is most troubling to me in 2021? I think it is this notion of America first. To me, that means simply America alone, or America isolated. And I am sad and sorry that this administration has, in large part, turned its back on the United Nations, withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord, from WHO, from UNESCO. It's cut its contributions to UN family planning, to peacekeeping. It's withdrawn from the Human Rights Council. It has left behind a vacuum. And we all know that a vacuum is filled and will be by China or some other countries. The alliances have been dismissed, and the opportunity to build coalitions with smaller countries has been lost. The staff of the State Department, as well as the US mission to the UN, has been depleted. And we need seriously an American ambassador at the United Nations who is an expert in foreign affairs, experienced, and a person of stature. I know that a new and different administration will see the UN as it is, imperfect but indispensable, and would commit to rejoining in every way to create a better world for all. Unitarians and Universalists understand this. For that and all that you do, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And if we cannot now end our differences,
at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
The United Nations is honoring this landmark anniversary as a critical threshold in our world's history. In 2020, it took the opportunity to take stock of how people need and want the UN to focus its efforts, looking toward 2045, when the UN will turn 100. We'll now show a short video created by the UN that looks at the role of our world community in shaping our shared future. Just to let you know, this video contains some sudden flashing and somewhat graphic images of natural disasters and conflict situations, so just be aware of that if you're sensitive to such things.
Our world is facing unprecedented challenges. Climate change is altering natural balance. And our precious wildlife is struggling to survive. We are battling a new era of conflict and violence. There's the disruptive impact from digital technologies and shifting demographics with gaping inequalities. Now, a global epidemic is reshaping our world as we know it. We are at a crossroad at a time when our world seems so divided. Our world is struggling to breathe. For for the United Nations 75th anniversary, we set out to ask the world, what are your hopes for your future?
If you could choose one thing to say to the UN, to world leaders about the future, what would that be?
In January 2020, the United Nations launched a global initiative to have the world's largest conversation on the future we want. Discussions have taken place in all settings, from classrooms to boardrooms, parliaments to village halls across the world, in order to reach as many people as possible. The United Nations listened, and the world spoke.
Justice, equality, and freedom for all.
People can really be in peace and with dignity, because our dignity was taken away from us because of our religion and because of who we are. And I hope that we are the last community who are suffering of those problems.
Health is often looked at as an expense. It is not. It is an investment.
We change by exchanging without losing ourselves.
We have run out of excuses and we are running out of time.
If we don't stop the destruction of our natural world, nothing else will matter.
More than ever before, we need solidarity, hope, and the political will to see this crisis through together.
From what we have heard, the world is not as divided as we thought. The global economy, healthcare, sanitation, education, and the hardest places hit are our top priorities from recovering from the pandemic. In response to COVID-19, greater international solidarity is urgently needed. The threat of climate change and destruction of our natural environment is the biggest fear for the future. We need increased efforts to reduce conflict and violence, and we aspire to further protect human rights. For optimism about our future, we need to look to our young people. The overwhelming majority of us believe global cooperation is more vital than ever.
Every time we fail to find solutions to global challenges, the most vulnerable people in our societies are hit the hardest.
Throughout history, we have accomplished unimaginable things, propelling each generation further than the last. There is no limit to the amount of good we can achieve together to make this world, our world, a better place. The challenges before us are universal, and we know that these challenges demand global solutions. We have the blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. The Sustainable Development Goals. In 2045, the United Nations 100th year, let's see the change we have implemented today that will shine a light on our children's tomorrow.
Change is coming. The real power belongs to the people.
And I want to turn the question inside out as well. I will not ask, how dare you? Instead, I will ask, do you dare to?
This is the most urgent of times and the most urgent of messages. Now must be our moment for action.
It's now my honor to introduce Hawa Diallo, a friend of all NGOs at the UN. She is Chief Civil Society Unit Outreach Division, Department of Global Communications at the United Nations. As young as she seems, she's had 30 plus years at the United Nations, experience working in various positions in the Department of Public Information and the Office of the Deputy Secretary General, United Nations. Peacekeeping experience in Somalia and Cambodia, as well as country level and community development program management experience focused on youth, girls, and women with UN Habitat's Nairobi and New York offices. She does extensive work in public information and outreach, as well as fostering partnerships with civil society, local government, and the private sector. Please welcome Hawa Diallo.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I think you have the dibs on me. You may be on my mom's payroll or something. But thank you so much, everybody, and good evening to everyone. As Bruce says, I'm proudly serving in the Civil Society Unit in the Department of Global Communication. And it's really a pleasure to be with everybody virtually today. A special thanks, of course, to our DGC associated NGO, Unitarian Universalist Association, and the NGO Committee on Human Rights for putting this together and inviting me. A special big thank you really goes to Bruce, who I've known for many years. I've had the privilege and honor to collaborating with him on so many initiatives to raise the voice of NGOs at the UN headquarters. I want to also take this time to congratulate all the participants, the organizations, and the distinguished speakers that have come ahead of me who have logged in today to celebrate UN 75. So 75 years, since the founding, the work of the UN remains vital today, even more than ever. We've come a long way over the past 75 years with tremendous strides in many areas. The UN has, faced a lot of challenges. We're looking at the current situation with the pandemic, with conflict, unrest, and unrest in the world. But I mean, I have to say that, for me, I try to look at the UN in a personal way and look at the tremendous achievements in the areas of education, peacekeeping, which, as Bruce said, I personally had an opportunity to be part of, or tackling extreme poverty and hunger. We've moved from a world where a third of the population lived in non-self-governing territories. That's especially important for me. I'm originally from Sierra Leone on the Golden West Coast of Africa. We've moved from a time where most women, didn't have equal voting rights to a time that, we are freer in many more ways that we can mention. We have also, through the United Nations, won great victories. One that I can think about, because we are in this challenge of the global pandemic of COVID, is the eradication of smallpox, which was spearheaded by the World Health Organization. That alone saved millions of lives globally, especially in the global south. It remains the only infectious disease that has been wiped out. So we know that there's still much more to do, and we need really to come together more than ever now. But achievements such as the one that I mentioned, gives me hope, and I'd like to think that it gives all of us hope. So this year has made us all really rethink the way we work, and has certainly shaped the UN's drive and necessity to further convene multilateral diplomacy to solve global issues, such as addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has underscored the need for a strengthened and renewed multilateralism. Today, the urgency for all countries is to come together, for all people to come together to fulfill the promise of the Nations United. I mean, this feeling, this notion has never been greater. Thinking about this, I mean, part of my job, and I think the United Nations as a whole, is to call on civil society, more than ever, to depend on them, to contribute towards an inclusive multilateral approach to tackling global issues. This is especially important towards the achievement of the 2030 agenda. And, honestly, when I think about it as a UN staffer who has really had the privilege of working with civil society, women's groups, youth groups, in reality, many of the NGOs, many of our civil society partners are already doing this. They have taken the lead in the last couple of years, especially as we're leading up to celebrating UN 75. really working to make sure that multilateralism is the way to go. As you know, the 2030 Agenda rests on the integration of 3 interdependent and complementary pillars: economic development, social development, and environmental protection, of course, with human rights at its core. The prosperity, dignity, and well-being of people, with a promise to leave no one behind and to reach those furthest behind, is first. And it's actually a common goal that we all have. I want to highlight faith-based organizations and their leaders who have long played a critical role in addressing the needs of those left behind. These entities are often times, the go-to people on the ground. They work in areas that no one dares to go. They can break down the barriers where even governments are not able to do so, because they really build a long-standing trust and relationship with people on the ground. That trust is what propels them to do the work that they do. And really, we depend on them so much. And that said, I want to acknowledge the dedication and the contributions of these organizations, such as UUA, and commend and thank them for the important role that they play in global issues, but specifically in meeting Agenda 2030, including the global goals. Their significant work on the ground has a direct impact in communities and at the grassroots level. Civil society organizations, including faith-based organizations, have been invaluable partners to the UN. And once again, I'm pleased to celebrate the 75th anniversary of this organization with you. I want to take this special opportunity to thank one of our own, again, UUA, for their long-standing support to the Department of Global Communications, especially when it comes to putting together the UN Civil Society Conference, which has been taking place over 60 somewhat odd years, and especially the support that UUA has given to bolster the UN's efforts to strengthen engagement with civil society. The New York office has especially played an important role in this area. Now, I'm preaching to the choir because people here know the value of the UN, notwithstanding, and know the reality of the context in which we're working in. But I try to every day, personally, as a person, to wake up on the right side of the United Nations. And, I was happy to hear somebody mention Sierra Leone in terms of IFAD's work there. The United Nations is something that has always been around me without me even knowing about it. I ended up working at the United Nations, and I can say there was one day where I was doing some research and I came across a photo of my father, who happened for many years be the ambassador of Sierra Leone to the United Nations. And there was one picture that caught my eye. I hope I don't get too emotional. It was a picture of the delegation of Sierra Leone that included my father. At that time, he was an ambassador. I think he held some position in government. And they were raising the flag of Sierra Leone at the United Nations. This was sometime in 1961, 62. For me, personally, that's what United Nations means. That's what United Nations Day stands. Every day for me is United Nations. I think people are quick to identify the negative things or the shortcomings of the UN. But self-determination for Sierra Leone, for somebody like me, a citizen, is something that we hold dearly. And that when we think about the United Nations, this is something that comes to mind. I also want to highlight the fact that United Nations is beyond a building. It's beyond member states. It's beyond resolutions. You have hundreds, thousands of people like me or the staff who work in the civil society unit, who stand behind the UN, who come to work every day with a dedication. That is United Nations Day to me. And I think we always just have to keep that in mind and look at the UN in its holistic, context. And I, have been telling people that these are things that I like to remember. And as I close off, I want to say, let's remember and try to keep close to our hearts that, you know, United Nations, you know, has a place for us, and that it's a place that unites us and brings us together. And it does so more than dividing us. And really working together, we can really make the world a better place for all. And this is really something that I personally believe as a UN staff person, but as Hawa Diallo, the person from Sierra Leone. Thank you so much, Bruce, for allowing me to be part of this session. Again, I want to congratulate you and the work that you do. Looking forward to further collaboration. Thank you so much, and over.
Thank you so much, Hawa. We're going to have to do a sustainable fashion show again. Thanks for all that you do and all that your staff does.
I can hardly wait for that.
It's now my honor to introduce to you Chris King, Chief Strategic Planning Unit, Office of Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. Chris is an accomplished external affairs and government communications professional with significant experience in emerging markets, regulatory and investment environments, political risk, and international security. Please welcome our friend, Chris King.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I think you got my LinkedIn profile there. Clearly, when I was looking at jobs in the private sector before I started working for the UN.
That's where I got it.
I'm going to have to update that one. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you. I guess I want to start, I think, as we probably all should start, by expressing my sympathy and solidarity with all of those out there who are suffering through this horrendous pandemic. Again, I want to thank Bruce and UUA for their ongoing partnership, their ongoing friendship with the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. I think UUA and your colleagues in the faith groups are some of our staunchest advocates and some of our most energetic friends. So I thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for organizing this event, because despite the many challenges that we faced this year, it's really important to remember that 2020 is also an opportunity to appreciate how much we've achieved as an international community over the last 3
It looks like Chris is frozen on us. So Bruce, maybe do you want to go to our next speaker, and if Chris can return, we can return to him.
Okay.
Sorry, then I accidentally just muted you.
Okay. All right. We hope to get back to Chris, who works on disarmament affairs at the United Nations. It's now my honor to introduce to you Craig Mokhiber, Chief Development and Economic and Social Issues Branch of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He was also a featured speaker at our seminar this year, and really got very high marks from all of our participants for his very powerful words and participation. He's a human rights defender, activist, international lawyer, and specialist in human rights law, policy, and methodology. Please welcome Craig Mokhiber.
Thank you very much, Bruce. A little evidence there of how long we've known each other. You just used a title I haven't had in a dozen years, so that gives you an idea of how long we've known each other. Thank you for that, and thanks to all of the other speakers, and thanks for inviting me to be here today. It's been a great conversation so far, and I think it's a great moment, 75 years after the establishment of the United Nations, to actually be looking back, but also looking forward. And I think when Chris reconnects, it sounds like he was also going to talk a bit about some of, I think, the very important achievements of the last 75 years. And somebody mentioned today that the UN has just won its 12th Nobel Prize, this time for the World Food Program. And I think that says something about the relevance of the organization. But I think a lot of talk these days is about the many crises that we are facing: the human rights crisis, the climate crisis, the economic crisis, the health crisis, the security crisis. I think at the core of all of this, if I can say so, is a crisis of values. And it's not the first time we have seen a global crisis of values. It was indeed a crisis of values that led ultimately to the establishment of the United Nations all those 75 years ago. And I think we have to remember that the response to those crises at that time was not an effort to sort of shy away from or to turn in fear away from the crisis of values that was confronting the world at that time. Instead, what we did was we came together in a struggle against fascism, against commodification of human dignity in so many ways following the Great Depression, against militarism and imperialism and colonialism and ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism, words that sound very familiar today, just as they did in the 1930s in our world. And the ultimate response to all of those challenges and to that crisis of values was the assertion of a different set of values as reflected in the establishment of the United Nations, and a charter that was dedicated explicitly to peace, to human rights, to development, to dignity, and to equality, and to international cooperation and to international law as a way of achieving those objectives. So why do we still need the United Nations today? Well, because the pendulum swings. It swings from dark to light, and now I'm afraid it's swinging back in the direction of darkness once again, all around us. So I think it's really important that we look at this moment in history, when in the beginning of the 21st century, we're being confronted with staggering levels of inequality, of deprivation, of abuse of all kinds, of exploitation, chauvinisms of every brand that you can imagine, and enormous concentrations of wealth and power that render any serious notions of democracy really only rhetorical shells or fantasy. And on our streets, African Americans, for example, being cut down day after day, or in our homes, people being ravaged, their health and their lives and their livelihoods being ravaged by the global pandemic of COVID-19, disproportionately hitting particular groups in society, older persons, for example, persons with underlying health disorders, persons with disabilities, but also persons in lower socioeconomic groups, which in many societies, including the one in which we're speaking, tracks very closely with race and with ethnicity. And of course, minorities and workers being hit disproportionately as well. And all of these intersecting global crises that the UN was built to respond to, economic, climate, energy, security crises, all of these are borderless crises, borderless threats that cannot be addressed without coming together globally across borders to fight back against them based upon the values that are contained in the UN Charter. We've brought with us many of the challenges of the 20th century as well. Sexism and militarism and foreign occupation, homophobia, racism, genocide itself, torture, even old-fashioned Nazism has followed us into the 21st century. And to make it even more difficult, we've layered on top of that a whole set of challenges in the new century that we've yet to find an answer to. New human rights threats like the abuse of new technologies, from mass surveillance to killer robots, the existential threat of climate change that has been mentioned already, and levels of inequality that have not been seen since feudal times in our world. That's the reality of the 21st century. But that's what this house was born into. That's what the United Nations was built to address. Remember, in the last century, the colonialist atrocities of that century, European genocides during that time, racial segregation in the United States, the outbreak of the First World War, the Great Depression, World War II, the atomic massacres in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in 1948, both the Nakba and the birth of apartheid. This is why we are compelled to come together in an organization like the United Nations. In those days, for much of the world, economic and social rights like healthcare and housing and water and sanitation, social security, labor rights, those were not rights that you were entitled to without discrimination, but they were commodities for sale to those who can afford them, or privileges for some who are born into them. And security was not also defined through the lens of our values. Security then was based upon state notions of state security or protecting the state or the wealthy elite, rather from the perspective brought to us by the UN of human security. The idea that security is freedom from fear and freedom from want without discrimination for all human beings. Today, we see things like killings, torture, and arbitrary arrest and detention being deemed as defenses of security rather than assaults on security because of this old archaic notion of state security reappearing in governments all around the world. And of course, the concept of the other has opened the door to racism and to bigotry, profiling and persecution, and ultimately also in our century, genocide. This is what the UN was created to combat against. And I agree with Hawa that the UN is not a building. She said that it's people, and she's right. It's people within the UN and outside the UN who mobilize around these values to fight for the kind of world that we think we deserve and that we think that we should have. But the UN is also an idea. It's not a neutral entity that any country or any organization can step into and try to use politics to advance a particular goal. The UN stands for something. It stands for those values that are contained in its charter. It's an idea that human rights and peace and security and development and economic progress must be governed by the rule of law, not by chance, not by privilege, not by force, but by the rule of law. Well, that idea is in trouble right now. It's in trouble all around the world, and you can see it in the threats against the United Nations. We are fully engaged in that struggle, and I think it is that struggle that will determine whether human dignity is going to be advanced or crushed in our lifetime and for all future generations. And this is not motherhood and apple pie. Not everyone is on the side of human rights and peace and development and equality. There are powerful forces on the other side, and those forces are growing. They find themselves at the head of governments in all regions of the world now. They find themselves in large corporations and other organizations. They find themselves in media companies. So we are not necessarily without a struggle in advancing these. But that struggle has been raging for 75 years, and it's our job, I think, to pick up the banner and make sure that we carry it forward. This new global compact of humanity that is the UN Charter, that says that everyone is born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that it is the duty of governance at all levels, nationally and internationally, to ensure freedom from fear and freedom from want for all people without discrimination. That all civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as the right to development, are rights to which we are all entitled without discrimination. And that everyone is entitled to a social order nationally and to an international order in which all of these human rights can be fully realized, and that they must be protected by the rule of law. That we must ensure accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims, protection for the vulnerable, empowerment of rights holders, and the capacity to deliver on rights by duty bearers, especially our governments. That's the mission. That's the challenge. There's a pushback, but we can push harder. With the strength of civil society, with faith groups, with non-governmental human rights organizations, with defenders of the climate, defenders of the water, defenders of our environment, defenders of land, defenders of the rights of all groups around, we are many. And we can win this struggle if we stay mobilized in defending that vision of the UN Charter. So I'm very happy that we've had an opportunity to have this conversation 75 years in, and that you've included us in that conversation. And I want to congratulate you for convening this, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. Okay, can we get Chris back now? Chris, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
So let me reintroduce you a little bit. You're working at the Office of Disarmament Affairs, and you've spoken at one of our previous seminars and been a good friend and collaborator on everything to do with disarmament, which is a key mission of the United Nations. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to leave my video off just to ensure that try and make it easier case I drop out. I've dropped out twice now, so hopefully I'll stay on this time. As I said, from the very beginning of the institution of the United Nations, nuclear disarmament has been a priority. The first resolution of the General Assembly called for the elimination of so-called atomic weapons, and over the ensuing decades, the United Nations disarmament machinery has birthed multiple groundbreaking treaties in pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons, including the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, and most recently the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In 1978, the very first General Assembly Special Session on disarmament formally articulated that disarmament, as outlined in the UN Charter, remains a priority for the organization, and it highlighted that the elimination of nuclear weapons was the highest disarmament priority. And this remains the case today for two reasons that are almost universally acknowledged. The first is that nuclear weapons are the only weapons with potentially existential consequences, that is, quite literally wiping out existence on the planet. And second, that any use of a nuclear weapon in a populated area would likely create a humanitarian catastrophe of such proportions that no country could adequately respond. After decades of good progress, efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons are unfortunately trending in the wrong direction. As the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs has said, the risk of a nuclear weapon being used today is higher than it has been since the darkest days of the Cold War. There is an urgent need to reinforce the global nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime and ensure it remains fit for purpose in these turbulent times. That regime includes plurilateral, bilateral, and even unilateral arrangements and instruments, but it's the multilateral instruments that are its load-bearing pillars. Global problems require global solutions, and multilateral solutions have proven to be lasting ones. The global pursuit of nuclear disarmament epitomizes this. While the countries that possess nuclear weapons have a responsibility to lead, including through the full implementation of their commitments and obligations, the use of these catastrophic weapons would affect all countries. That means that all countries have a role to play in reducing nuclear dangers, preventing nuclear war, and bringing about the elimination of nuclear weapons. And nowhere is that role more important or more prominent than in multilateral forums such as the First Committee of the General Assembly. Today, as relations between nuclear armed states corrode, as billions are spent on improving nuclear weapons, and as we see a dangerous return to Cold War concepts such as nuclear warfighting, multilateral disarmament approaches under the auspices of the UN system are as important as ever. They provide invaluable opportunities to diffuse tensions, engage in much needed dialogue, negotiate in good faith, build trust and confidence, and develop solutions. I think as we've all heard tonight, as with all multilateral endeavors, producing results is by no means easy. But as I said, those results are lasting and they incorporate the views of all. Multilateral forums also provide opportunities to listen to a plurality of views, not least the expertise of civil society, but also to improve access for underrepresented groups. The UN strives to ensure gender equality in disarmament forums, primarily because it's proven to produce more effective results. And we also believe in providing a platform for young people, the future peace builders. In our complicated security environment, the voices of these groups as advocates for peace and disarmament can't be overstated, but nor can their responsibility to use those voices. 75 years after the UN's founding, the international community has proven it can work together to make progress in nuclear disarmament, the UN's highest disarmament priority. Yet the shadow of nuclear weapons continues to hang over us all. We need to cast our minds back 75 years and recall the devastation of the use of nuclear weapons, but also the hope contained in the foundation of the UN that it could address such global challenges, and use both of these as incentives to redouble our efforts to rid the world of these terrible weapons. The United Nations and the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs is committed to working with its member states, to its civil society, and to with all interested individuals as we seek to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. It's now my honor to introduce a very good friend, Bobbi Nassar. Dr. Bobbi Nassar is a retired social work professor at Yeshiva University. She plays a pivotal role to ensure that the UN headquarters in New York remains focused on human rights. When I arrived at the UN in 2008, there were about 3 staff at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. at the UN in New York. Bobbi worked hard with NGOs and with the Office of the High Commissioner to increase both staff and the importance of human rights at the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council in New York. She's a champion of human rights and a recognized authority in this field. Please welcome Bobbi Nassar.
Hi, I'm very happy to be with all of you. And I think the main thing I want to talk about is this. It says something, okay. The main thing I want to talk about is the importance of civil society and coalition building. I think that the NGO Committee on Human Rights, of which Bruce and I are co-chairs and have been for some time, is an example of coalition building. And Craig mentioned earlier that it's for all of us together to be involved in different types of movements, and I would call them mostly social justice movements. And the main thing that I want to focus on just for a few minutes is the horrible practice that's going on throughout the world, but specifically in the US, of criminalizing protests, perfectly peaceful civil protests. And we're seeing this in a very active way right now, and throughout this, I'll call it the criminal justice system. It's not actually a justice system, the way it's currently constructed, with the privatization of prisons, with the power equation being heavily on the side of I'll just call them the authorities, that we're seeing gross violations of human rights on the ground. We're seeing this on a regular basis. And if we combine that with the inequality, the horrendous inequality that's going on, and again, I'll talk specifically about the US, we know that right now, during the pandemic, there's been this huge profit taking on the side of the billionaires. It's sort of horrifying even to hear about it. And on the other hand, the people that have very little have much less, to the point where in this country where this should never be happening, we have people that are really dealing with basic needs. I'm talking about food and shelter. And so I think that the whole idea of grassroots activity is what I want to just spend a couple minutes on. I represent an organization that it's called the International Federation of Settlement Houses, but they're all about working with people on the ground and finding out what people on the ground really want and doing everything they can to facilitate, I'll just call it advocacy, coming together, if it means making sure that people have the right kind of housing, the right kind of access to food, the right kind of access to schooling. That's very important. And what I've found at the UN is that it's a very good place for people to come together. And I think that's the beauty of the UN. And I'm going to reference Craig for a minute, so that really the access that we've all had within the UN system to come together and to advocate together has been, I think, crucial for all of us. So this is the time when I want to talk about John Lewis for a second. So we had this, wonderful leader in our country, John Lewis, who talked about getting into good trouble. And so my aspiration in life is to get into good trouble. And I have every intention of continuing. So that's what I think the NGO Committee on Human Rights is about. I think that's what civil society needs to be about. Because what we're doing is we're really saying to the authorities that have the power that we don't think things are as they should be. We're really going to do all we can to fight for all of us to have the same level of respect and rights, human rights. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say tonight. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bobbi. And now it's my honor to introduce to you the Reverend Alicia Roxanne Forde, who serves with the Unitarian Universalist Association as the director of the international office. That means she's our boss. Alicia is a graduate of the Iliff School of Theology and currently lives in Larchmont, Colorado. Alicia was born and spent her formative years in Trinidad and Tobago. She identifies as an African descent queer, cisgender female with deep roots in Tobago. She considers herself bicultural, and is grateful that her formative years enabled her to cultivate a global perspective. Alicia is a certified spiritual director and has strong interest in health and wellness. When she's not hiking, you can find her reading, working out, or podcast walking. Please welcome Reverend Alicia Forde.
Thank you, Bruce, and thanks to you and Allison for putting this event together. And to our speakers, Hawa, Chris, Craig, Bobbi, Vyda, Gretchen, and Reverend Susan, thank you so much for the inspiring words and reflections that you provided. And so grateful that we had so many folks in attendance for this event. So thank you so much. I'm starting off with a quote from Father Gregory Boyle, and I'll keep my remarks short. And Father Boyle says, "No daylight to separate us, only kinship, inching ourselves closer to creating a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. Soon we imagine with God this circle of compassion. Then we imagine no one standing outside of that circle, moving ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity have been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away." As you heard this evening, in today's world especially, global cooperation is necessary. It is vital to facing the challenges before us. We need to be about the business of discerning what we can and must do together to ensure that a just and thriving world exists for generations to come. May it be through global cooperation as modeled by and made possible by the UN, that we continue to keep co-creating solutions for basic services like healthcare, safety, which includes an end to state-sanctioned violence and an end to sexual and gender violence. Basic services like being free from climate crisis and the havoc that it creates, addressing ethno-nationalism and more. May it also be the case that we truly embody the solidarity that is so crucial to all, not just some, but all of us having access to the resources that will allow the interdependent web of all life not just survive, but to thrive. For no daylight separates us. We are bound together in kinship. Our Unitarian Universalist Association's office at the United Nations remains dedicated to working alongside our comrades and partners in making real our commitment to love and justice in this life. The work that we do is enriched by all of your efforts and your commitments to global human rights and domestic and international advocacy. So again, I extend my gratitude to you, the speakers and attendees, for your unwavering commitment to a world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all. We possess the tools to be bridge builders, my colleague Vyda Ng told us, and we do. May it be that we are not afraid to use those tools to keep moving closer to the margins, so that the margins themselves will be erased, situating ourselves right next to those deemed disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. Now more than ever, this is our moment for action. Do you dare to? My gratitude to you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Alicia. The UUA office at the United Nations has been doing this transformational work since 1962 Thanks to the generous support of Unitarian Universalists and others who believe in our goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. If you can, we ask that you please consider a gift now in honor of this important UN anniversary to keep our voice for inclusion, justice, and collaboration strong at the United Nations. You can give at giving.uua.org/UU@UN or text UN Sunday to 51555. Thank you so much for your generosity and for attending this event. We hope you will continue to be involved with our office at the UN and continue to be an advocate for the United Nations. I invite you to join us this Sunday for a special UN Sunday UU the Vote for Climate Justice event. I'll end with a special word of enormous gratitude to all our presenters for sharing your expertise and insights with us during this busy week. Thank you so much. We are so, so grateful for all that you do. May we all continue to work together for a more livable future for all. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.